Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. It's really lovely to be here with you all. Really excited to engage in this conversation with all of you. So today we'll be talking about safer spaces and courageous conversations, support for TAs navigating an online environment. My name is Amina Abawajy. I use she and her pronouns, and I'm the education advisor with the Human Rights and Equity Services. So I do professional development and coordinate educational opportunities and programming for students, faculty, and staff on topics related to equity, diversity, and inclusion. So I'm really excited to engage in this conversation with you all, and I'll let Lisa introduce herself as well. But we would love to hear a little bit about you. So if you feel comfortable sharing a little bit about yourself in the chat box, perhaps your pronouns if you feel comfortable, your name, and what program or department you're connected with.
Thank you, Amina. This is Lisa Delong speaking, and I work very closely with Amina out of Human Rights and Equity Services. I'm the director of the office, and I also oversee the discrimination policy. And so we will be talking more about what that policy looks like and the way our office operates as we go through the presentation. So welcome, everybody.
Excuse me while I toggle between screens. But we want to acknowledge, and whenever we do any of our educational programming, we always acknowledge the territory in which it's taking place. So Dalhousie University sits on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people, and as peace and friendship treaty beneficiaries, so folks who reside here in Mi'kmaqi, this land is governed by the peace and friendship treaties, and these treaties, they outline our responsibilities as Indigenous and non-Indigenous to each other, but also to this land. These treaties, they are upheld in our Constitution. They are recognized. And as treaty people, we all have a responsibility to continuously educate ourselves and work in solidarity with Mi'kmaq and other across Turtle Island. And when we're talking about creating safer and more inclusive spaces, we must have courageous conversations about our histories of inclusion and exclusion and how that manifests in present day. So I talked a little bit about these treaties, and some of you may be aware, we do see current manifestations of colonialism and their impacts. And so some of you might be keeping tabs or connected to what's happening in Digby with the fisheries and exercising treaty rights and the right to a moderate livelihood for Mi'kmaq people. And so that's just one example of many examples in which we need to recognize the current context and realities. And so not only recognizing the territory that we're on, but how we can play a part in supporting and uplifting Indigenous experiences, voices, and realities. So I wanted to share some of the goals for this presentation. And so some of them are listed here: understanding the unique role of TAs as it relates to power, privilege, and positionality; recognizing how discrimination, personal harassment, and sexualized violence can manifest in online environments; appreciating the shared responsibility of establishing an intentionally safer environment; and identifying the Dalhousie resources and supports available to TAs. So those are some of the goals for the workshop. But when doing these workshops, I also like to share some community standards. So how can we meet these goals? How can we set expectations for ourselves and each other? And what do we need to bring our full selves into this space? And so as I read some of your comments and introductions, what I ask folks to kind of turn your mind to is, what do you need to fully participate and engage in this workshop? So some things that have come up in previous workshops is an attitude of openness, cooperation, trust, support, and respect. So recognizing that we're all in different places of our learning journey. Some of these concepts may be new, some of these concepts might be familiar, but really approaching this space and other folks' experiences with an attitude of openness, fostering spaces of trust and support, and of course maintaining respectful dialogue throughout. Trying to understand different perspectives. As I mentioned, we're all on different paths and all in different spaces in our learning journey, and we all come from different walks of life, and so trying to understand the various perspectives that we hold, and fostering a non-judgmental space, recognizing that the process is as important as the outcome. And so, of course, we want to move towards creating more safer spaces and more inclusive spaces, and that process can look different for different folks, but that process is really important, and the steps that we take in engaging in that process is really important. And so, recognizing and holding that as we move towards the outcome. And it's not a destination, it's something that we recommit to and work through every day, and so it's important to recognize that as well. And of course, practicing self-care and community care. Some of these topics can land differently for different folks, and so we encourage you folks to engage in the material and in this discussion in the way you can. But also do what you need to do to feel good, to feel comfortable, to feel like you can participate and go through this. Feel free to come and go as you need. As was mentioned, this session being recorded, and so I believe that there will be opportunities to reconnect if that is ever the case. But these are some community standards that, again, they've come up previously. If anyone has any other community standards that they'd like to add to this list, please feel free to do so in the chat box, and we can revisit this list as needed throughout the workshop. So we want to talk about positionality and privilege. So positionality is the social, political context that creates your identity in terms of race, class, gender, sexuality, ability, and other identifiers. Something that I also want to bring into this space, and I think some folks are familiar with this concept of intersectionality, and so thinking about the ways in which these identities can intersect and the unique experiences and challenges that come with that those intersection of identities. So positionality also describes how your identity influences and potentially biases your understanding of and outlook on the world. And so when we're talking about anti-racism, when we're talking about safer spaces and social justice, it's really important to think through our positionality and privilege and how we come to these conversations, because they often inform how we engage with those spaces. And so sitting with and trying to work through the spaces and contexts in which we hold privilege, but also the spaces and contexts in which we don't, is a really integral piece of understanding how we can navigate these discussions. And so there are a number of different activities and guided reflection activities that can help think through these things. I often do a social location activity in some of these workshops, and so really just thinking about access, privilege, power, and how that relates to us in present day. So what are safer spaces and what are courageous conversations? So a safer space is a supportive, non-threatening environment where all participants can feel comfortable to express themselves and share experiences without fear of discrimination or reprisal. We use the word safer to acknowledge that safety is relative. Not everyone feels safe under the same conditions. By acknowledging the experiences of each person in the room, we hope to create as safe an environment as possible. The responsibility for fostering a safer space really falls with all of us. And as TAs, as educators, as community members, we each have an obligation to foster spaces where others feel like they belong, where others feel they can participate and engage in that material. And it's all of our responsibilities, especially in the unique role as a TA, to think about how we can do so in proactive ways. So thinking about, when we're setting up our discussion boards and our bright spaces, what are ways that we can signal, what are ways that we can draw folks' attention towards this intentionality, towards creating these safer spaces in a way that is really focused and central. So we're going to talk about some tips to really navigating online spaces and how we can kind of do so in this virtual reality. But thinking about visibility, thinking about really setting the expectations, kind of following throughout the semester is really, I think, an integral piece to this conversation as it relates to TAs. And so that's safer spaces. And again, I really want to go back to this acknowledgement that safety is relative. And so sometimes I see safe spaces, people talk about safe spaces a lot, but safety really is relative. As it says, not everyone feels safe under the same conditions. People have various accessibility needs when it comes to fostering safer spaces. And so recognizing that it's relative, I like to use the phrase safer. But courageous conversations, and I think these two terms really come hand in hand, happen when engaging, sustaining, and deepening relational dialogue and discussion centered on values and that checks underlying assumptions. Building an atmosphere of trust and respect is key to both enabling individuals to participate in courageous conversations and establishing a culture in which courageous conversations and feedback are seen as necessary. And so, as someone whose communication style can sometimes be avoidant, I understand the draw to perhaps not engage in uncomfortable conversations and discussions. But I really am here to tell myself first and foremost, but also in part that it's really important to engage in these uncomfortable conversations and not shy away from them. It's really important to hold these spaces and if folks bring up experiences, whether that's happening in the spaces that you're a part of or elsewhere that impact them as individuals and as students within your classroom or community, it's really important to try and engage in those courageous conversations, try to provide support and resources if you feel like those conversations are kind of outside of your depth or you may need some support in navigating those. Taking those initial steps, you bring a caring and compassionate lens to the work that you do, pulling in those supports and resources that we'll talk about shortly, but really engaging in those uncomfortable conversations is so, so important. So we did have a discussion question here, and if there are any questions, again, please feel free to pop them in the chat box. Robin, would we be able to turn the mics on for the discussion? So we wanted to get folks thinking again about those proactive steps that folks can take. So what are some opportunities to create safer spaces and hold courageous conversations as part of your role? I see Christine, you have your hand. Feel free to turn on your microphone.
Yeah, I've had two pretty intense conversations with profs this past week actually. One being about the potential appropriation of Indigenous culture that was happening in one of the courses, and then also the proper use of pronouns for one of our students. And it was tough, like, because I'm the TA, and especially in the pronouns conversation, I obviously was trying to speak up for the student who wasn't present, but then I also feel like I'm the staff here, like they're my boss, and it was hard to have that conversation to the full extent because I also didn't want to insult the prof. Anyways, that's my experience.
Thanks so much for sharing that, Christine. And you bring up some really great points around power, privilege, and positionality, and really the different ways that can play out, right? In one way, you feel a sense of responsibility and power to advocate for your students, but you're also trying to navigate that kind of power imbalance and relationship with that professor. And so how do you navigate those difficult, important conversations while kind of keeping all of those pieces in mind? Yeah, thanks so much for sharing that. Lisa, I don't know if you had anything you wanted to share on this.
Thank you. I think that's a great point. And again, further to what Amina said, the idea of having to be really open with your, with the professor is a very uncomfortable thing. The themes that you've identified also are themes that we're seeing. I would say in our office, we're seeing quite a wider gap between students' expectations and some of our faculty members' sort of ways of engaging and ways that they have engaged, historically. And so it's incumbent on all of us, and particularly, my office, but all of us really to build that capacity and have these conversations. And so, and whenever you find yourself in a situation like that, where for you personally to have the conversation is uncomfortable, I'll just flag that we'll be returning to this in our presentation, that we are a resource and we can also kind of carry those conversations with the faculty member for you. And we engage with CLT really regularly as well on these really tricky ones.
Thanks, Lisa. Does anyone else want to share? And Christine, if you have a response to that as well, feel free to jump back in.
We were very lucky that actually the scenario with the appropriation of culture, we did have a third party come in. Now I'm not actually even the TA for that class, but in our school, like, everyone kind of is aware of everything. So, but I heard that like a third party person did come in. I'm not sure if they were CLT or kind of which department they came from, but apparently, a discussion was facilitated in the classroom, and apparently it yielded some really wonderful conversation. And so it's nice to hear that, like, those, as you say, courageous conversations are happening. Yeah, I'm excited to hear what else Lisa's going to say later. But yeah.
Excellent. I'm glad to hear that. That's a great sort of end or start, I would say, of that conversation. Wonderful. Excellent. So I think we'll move on to the next slide, and this is one where I will just like to take a bit of time in our presentations to really share with the group a broad context around our human rights frameworks, where most people are familiar with the concept of human rights, are typically familiar with a couple of the characteristics that would be protected. But I always like to take a little bit of time and talk about what discrimination is. And so these are the characteristics under the Nova Scotia Human Rights Act, which is our human rights framework here in the province. And these are the characteristics that are protected. Now, my screen has just gone a little wobbly. Are you all able to see? Are you still able to see the screen? I'll just pull it up on my own.
I'll get on the end.
Okay, perfect. So what you'll see on the screen are a number of characteristics that are protected, but also the year that they were included in the Human Rights Act. And I like to do that just because I feel that it gives a nice illustration of the way human rights work. And that is really often called a living tree or an evolving area of the law. And so you can see in 1969, when the Human Rights Act first came into force, there were only a few characteristics that were protected. So race, color, religion, creed, ethnic national origin, association. That means being associating with somebody who has these protected characteristics, as well as retaliation. And retaliation often brings questions. So people say, well, what is retaliation? What does that mean? What does that like? And really, retaliation is included in the human rights framework because it is a protection against retribution for raising human rights concerns. Because people often feel very unsafe coming forward with their concerns. And certainly where human rights are protected are in situations like housing and employment and education, where there's a real power imbalance, like a structural power imbalance as well. And so what retaliation means is that you can't be retaliated against, or if you are, that there's process and there's protection. For raising a human rights concern, but not only that, or participating in someone else's human rights concern. So even witnesses who engage in support of someone's complaint have that protection as well. The other characteristics, I just like to go through and make sure that we all have a common understanding of what they are, and I'll just read down the columns. So sex, that relates to gender, but you'll see pregnancy wasn't protected in 1972. Pregnancy came much later, so you could actually legally be discriminated against on the basis of becoming pregnant, for example. Gender identity, gender expression was only included in 2012, although practically that protection was offered under other characteristics under the sex provision, but the real value of it being explicitly included really does make it much more incumbent on employers and service providers to bring their systems up to a level that is consistent with diverse gender identities and expressions. So, for example, gender neutral washroom space is something that we're still working towards, but it's certainly historically not been widely available. Physical disability was protected in 1974, but you can see mental disability came 12 years later in 1986. Source of income is a theme that often raises questions, and I'll explain where that one comes from. Source of income was included in the human rights framework because people were being denied access to housing because of receiving social assistance. So landlords weren't renting, for example, to somebody who maybe was benefiting or receiving social benefits or social assistance. And of course, what that aims to do is avert the cyclical nature of poverty and the extreme discrimination that often is associated with poverty. In 1991, I'm jumping to the next column, sex, pregnancy was included. Age in 1991 as well. Aboriginal origin, 1991, which again, quite late when you consider the general framework that was in place. Same with sexual orientation, only in 1991. Sexual harassment as well. So sexual harassment is also covered by the sex provision, but sexual harassment means, being denied a benefit or offered an advantage in reaction to being sexually harassed. Political affiliation, also 91, marital status, family status. So family status means being in a parent and a child relationship. So I have protection, for example, as a parent. If an employer, for example, didn't want to hire me because I'm a parent, for example. And the last one, 1991 as well, irrational fear of contracting an illness. And that is in response to the extreme discrimination that was being faced by folks who were HIV positive or who were perceived to be HIV positive or were perceived to be gay and therefore perceived to be more likely to be HIV positive, for example. So those are the human rights in Nova Scotia, all of these characteristics. Are there any thoughts or questions about that? I know we've got the chat function now, and maybe you have your microphones as well if you wanted to flag or raise any questions about the legal framework here. Yeah. See a question? Shazia, is that how you pronounce your name?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you.
Hi. So I'm Shazia. I'm the new educational developer, internationalization and intercultural competency with the Center for Learning and Teaching.
Welcome.
I'm actually intrigued by this kind of the way that you have put this information here, and I was thinking that, and it's a question, that how are these concerns seen from a global perspective, because I was reading an article today about it's the focus is EDI, but it's talking about the three layers of how the process worked in that particular context where the article was. That it was about awareness, providing knowledge, and then expecting for action. So I'm thinking about not only international students, but also our mainstream Canadian students who see these issues from a global perspective, how these elements of discrimination are either practiced, seen as, responded to, or there are assumptions, because I've seen that there are assumptions about other cultures of, for example, this certain element is seen in Canada this way, but that's how it's seen in another culture, without going into kind of deeper into those conversations. So my question to the two of you is just that, do we have this space where we create this awareness from global perspective as well, so that, there's kind of a divergent but also convergent points of view, if you understand what I mean, right?
Yeah, I'm not sure I understand exactly your question, but I'll try, and we can have the conversation beyond that. I think that's an excellent point, Shazia, and I think that we see I think threads of your conversation and themes in a lot of different ways here at Dalhousie. So we see situations where folks might be really pleased, for example, international students, for example, to learn of the protection for sexual orientation, because it maybe is not something that is protected, in their home country. And so they are kind of grappling with some new freedoms, for example, or maybe struggling with some challenges in terms of maybe coming out at home, or, worry about social media, making its way back if they're out here but not at home, for example. And so we have those kinds of conversations around how our legal frameworks might be in some ways broader. But in other ways, I think that, human rights, and we recognize human rights is really a floor and not a ceiling. So these are kind of the basics, right? This is kind of our baseline. But the kinds of conversations that you would be having around intercultural awareness is really around respect and inclusiveness. And so a lot of the work that we do is really under that broader umbrella of fostering an inclusive and respectful community in a way that, is more open and more free for people as a general sort of accessible way of existing. Yeah, and so I think, this, as I said, we like to start with this baseline just because it often comes as some surprise to folks. And also for TAs, I think it's important to know of these nuances just because you're in the business of also accommodating students. And so with all of these protected characteristics are associated duties for the university to provide and rights of the students to receive accommodation based on all of these characteristics. Mm-hmm. We are more familiar with the concept of accommodation around religion and disability. Those are the two that we typically see more frequently. But for example, pregnancy, family status, so caregiving young children, for example, is a protected characteristic, and we have an equal responsibility and equal opportunity for students to seek accommodation for any of these characteristics. Mm-hmm. Does that help?
Yeah, no, I think I really like the idea. Was kind of the takeaway from your response. One of the takeaways is that it's a floor, not a ceiling. I really like this idea, kind of to put it into like a very illustrative perspective. Yeah, no, thank you very much for your response. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Amina, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, no, I was thinking, and that is that the newfound freedom, but also kind of understanding that they have rights. We have seen students become aware of those after they arrive here. Sometimes they feel that if they are, like you talked about challenges, that if they're not comfortable, for example, political affiliations, if you talk to about other territories in the world where we have a world view, but then there is a regional political view as well that's not seen as accepted or positive. So students get uncomfortable as that there is a European world view here in Canada and our political affiliations are seen from that lens. So that's kind of the challenge that they kind of try to overcome. But in terms of accommodations, I've always seen, always, and I'm using it very safely, that I've seen students become kind of very comfortable and respected in that way, that there are certain accommodations put in place that give them that positionality that Amina was talking about, in the beginning, that they're not just a student from China or a student from India or a student from, a certain country, but they're more than that, and that's how they can explore themselves. So, no.
Those are excellent points. And I think the other layer that is maybe helpful for TAs to have on radar as well is that we often also navigate situations where students, maybe, Canadian students, North American students, for example, take some of these rights as norms for international students in ways that may land as risky or harmful to the international students. So, for example, social media in residence, for example, posting things on Facebook or, and that can have implications. And so I think a lot of the conversations that we're having around building intercultural awareness really is also directed at students recognizing that what you may feel is a benign sort of neutral action, it might be sort of your norm to be very public in the ways of engaging, have real impact, real impact on people. So
impact for other people. I think that's a wonderful point, and that reminds me of an example where somebody thought that talking to a woman from Saudi Arabia about her relationship with her husband or taking care of kids or something like that is actually empowering her rather than kind of putting her at some kind of risk, which eventually happened, and then the situation had to be mitigated. But I think these creating that safe space where what we take as a norm does not become a judgment or an assumption. I think that's also very important, that, kind of giving the information, but also being respectful of how others see this particular characteristic. Thank you.
Right. Yeah, great point. Excellent. Great. So we have a discrimination policy at Dalhousie. So those characteristics that we talked about, there's a discrimination policy that creates process around that as well. So whenever somebody feels that they're being treated in a way that is unfair and inappropriate, that's connected with one of those protected characteristics, we have formal and informal complaint process options that we support through our office. We also have a personal harassment policy. And so personal harassment is behavior that is not connected with protected characteristics. So it doesn't need to be in any way associated with any of those characteristics that we've just looked at. Generally, conduct that is abusive, it's unfair, it's demeaning, directed at a person or a group of persons that is unwelcome, that it's either known to be unwelcome or a reasonable lens on it would say, yeah, that's unwelcome. Like it reasonably ought to be known to be welcome. Unwelcome or unwanted. So some kinds of examples that we see include, name calling, insults, threats, abusive language, shouting, spreading rumors, rude behavior that's persistent and is pervasive, and it's constantly critiquing another's work, for example. And so, it's kind of the behavior that is often associated with somebody who is just behaving badly. But it can be very, very toxic, and especially in a working environment or a learning environment, it's behavior that is really, really harmful and inappropriate. And so for this reason, we have a personal harassment policy at Dalhousie. Now, in some jurisdictions, personal harassment is also illegal. It's prohibited under occupational health and safety legislation. So workplace laws also govern that kind of behavior. Now, we don't in Nova Scotia currently have law against personal harassment, but at Dalhousie, we do have a policy. So this is an employee policy, our personal harassment policy. So it relates to any behavior of a Dalhousie employee that is behaving in this harmful way. If a student is considered to be engaging in harassing behaviors, that would be the Code of Student Conduct and the Residence Code that would come into play. So under our office, we do administer a personal harassment policy. And again, like the discrimination policy, it offers informal and formal complaint options that are available to folks. The other policy that we administer out of our office is a sexualized violence policy. And our sexualized violence policy is a new policy. We've had a previous policy around sexual harassment, but through a consult process and working with students, faculty, and staff, as well as external stakeholders, the title of this policy was determined to be sexualized violence out of a recognition for the extreme harm of any inappropriate sexual behavior. And so sexualized violence refers to an act of violence, whether it's physical or psychological in nature, that's characterized by an attempt to threaten, intimidate, coerce, or engage in any unwelcome behavior of a sexual nature against a member of the university community without that member's consent. So like our other policies, this is a policy that is directed at, ensuring and fostering an inclusive and supportive working and learning environment. And I think it does go without saying, but it's worth saying that any form of sexualized violence creates toxic environment and are profoundly harmful for people. And so we need to be really clear in building a common understanding of and capacity for addressing sexualized violence. So under our sexualized violence policy, we have a dedicated advisor who works very closely with folks who are raising concerns and also aiming to prevent and foster a more inclusive environment. And we also have a resource that's called a Purple Folder, and that is a resource. It's like a paper document, but we also have it available online. And that is a resource that's designed to support somebody who is receiving a disclosure of sexualized violence. Because what we know about sexualized violence is that people typically don't come forward to somebody like me in a designated office. They typically disclose first to somebody that they feel comfortable with, and that is often TAs. Actually, it's often younger faculty maybe that they associate more as a peer, or their TAs, somebody who may be seen in somewhat of a position of authority. And so I want to encourage you all to look. It's available on our website to take a look at our Purple Folder. And what that does is it outlines the kinds of things that may be brought to your attention. But it also gives really specific guidance around what to say, like what are helpful things to say in that very, stressful moment, but also what not to say. There's a number of opportunities for, finding some language that could be helpful, because what we know is any language that could be seen as victim blaming is profoundly harmful. Oh, thank you. Robin has just put the link in there for you. So I want to bring that to your attention so that you're aware of that resource. And as I said, if people do come forward and raise a concern, then we have an institutional responsibility as well. If it's a concern, that we want to make sure that the person is supported and referred to the appropriate resources. And if it relates to a respondent or a perpetrator that is within the Dalhousie community, then there are process options that are available to us as well.
Thanks so much, Lisa, for going through some of our policies. And policies really can act as kind of one form of support. And so a lot of our policies are shaped to have some educational pieces in there. And so I really do recommend folks to check those out, to read through them, and to make them available and point students to them as well. But going back to the point that was raised earlier around norms, a big part of that is something that we call microaggressions. And so a lot of these microaggressions are rooted in popular media. They're very subtle forms of discrimination. And as the definition here says, they can be brief, commonplace, verbal, behavioral, or environmental actions, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative slights and insults towards members of oppressed or targeted groups. And so what we're seeing more and more is that there is a pull away from these overt and really kind of in-your-face forms of discrimination. But what we're seeing a lot more of is these insidious, harder to place, harder to track, harder to identify forms of discrimination, often in the form of microaggressions. And so it's really important to recognize that microaggressions can be intentional or unintentional, But really, it's about the impact. It's about how it lands for the person or the group that you may be talking about. And that impact really cannot be, it cannot be kind of assessed in a way without really feedback or input from that person, right? So you may think that you're saying something, and I can share an example of a microaggression, but you may think you're saying something or doing something or not doing something that can communicate and land in a very different way than how you initially intended, but it really needs to focus on that impact. And so I've shared this example before, but I've been welcomed to Canada on a number of different occasions. And so, the words "Welcome to Canada" on their surface are quite, friendly. I'm sure the intention is quite positive, but for someone who was born and raised here, it really lands very differently. So it, expresses the sentiment that you don't belong here. So, for example, those very same words, when spoken to my mother, lands very differently, right? So it's, again, those very same words, but for my mother, that's an opportunity to talk about her culture and her family and her traditions, and it's a really positive engagement. But that very same engagement with me lands very differently. And so, again, we need to be focused on the impact. And there are some common microaggressions, and this video, I think, does a really good job of illustrating some of those that we can stay away from. But really, it's about having those courageous conversations, that feedback, and really kind of discussing and being engaged with the impact of our actions and our behavior and our interactions. And so I'm going to play a video here that, again, illustrates the concept of microaggressions really well. There is a little bit of swearing, so I like to give folks a little bit of a content warning before I share it. And hopefully the audio works okay through here. So let me know if you aren't able to see or hear it. Video.
For people who still don't think that microaggressions are a problem,
oh, you're so well spoken.
Oh, just imagine, instead of being a stupid comment, a microaggression is a mosquito bite.
It's a compliment.
Mosquito bites and their itch are one of nature's most annoying features. But if you're only bitten every once in a while...
Where are you really from?
Cleveland. Sure, it's annoying, but it's not that big a deal. The problem is that some people get bitten by mosquitoes a lot more than other people. I mean, a lot more. Whether it's on a date...
Oh, your English is so good.
Excuse me?
Going grocery shopping.
No, everything happens for a reason.
Commuting to work.
So when are you going to have a baby?
Watching TV.
We have to keep the Redskins name. Part of our culture and history.
Or just walking down the street with your partner.
I couldn't even tell you were gay.
Mosquitoes seem to pop up everywhere.
Do you know John? Shopping advice.
So
I live here too.
And getting bit by mosquitoes every goddamn day.
Can I touch your hair?
Multiple times a day.
So pretty. Can I touch your hair?
It's fucking annoying. And makes you want to go ballistic on those mosquitoes. Which seems like a huge overreaction to people who only get bit every once in a while.
It's just a mosquito bite. Who cares? Just another angry black one.
Of course, beyond just being annoying, some mosquitoes carry truly threatening diseases that can mess up your life for years.
Astrophysics? Maybe you should try this challenging major.
Ow, my dreams.
And other mosquitoes carry strains that can even kill you.
It looked like he was up to trouble. Okay? I felt threatened.
So next time you think someone's overreacting, just remember, some people experience mosquito bites all the time.
You're all so exotic. Wow.
And by mosquito bites, we mean microaggressions.
So what did folks think about that video? Feel free to type it in the box. It's one of my favorite teaching tools. I think it does a really good job of explaining perhaps a complex concept in a really illustrative way. But like I said, microaggressions are quite insidious in that, yeah, I do have a link. I will pop it in the chat. Maybe can I send it to Robin after the presentation?
Yeah, you can do that.
Okay. Yeah, it's quite a insidious form in that it's often in these offhand comments, it's often in these jokes that we laugh at, that we participate in, that we allow in our spaces, that really communicate hostile and derogatory messages. And again, that could be the intention or not, but it's about the impact for marginalized and members of oppressed or targeted groups. So how is that landing? How is that being felt for folks within those groups? So as I mentioned, there are some common ones that we can stay away from. But if folks are letting you know that this doesn't sit well with them, that it makes them uncomfortable, we really have that responsibility to stop doing that, to educate ourselves on why that was wrong and really commit to doing better. A lot of these microaggressions are rooted in and are part and parcel of unconscious and implicit bias. And so unconscious and implicit bias is the attitudes, assumptions, and stereotypes that we're not even aware of, but that affect our actions, understanding, interactions, and so by the name unconscious and implicit bias, we are not even aware of the biases that we hold. But they do impact and affect and come across in our actions, our decisions, and in the way that we navigate the world. I don't know if you folks have seen that example that was circulating on social media a couple years ago where identical sets of resumes were sent to employers. And so set of resumes had quote-unquote English-sounding names, while another set of resumes had quote-unquote non-English sounding names. And again, these resumes are identical, and they were sent to employers. And what we saw time and time again was that employers were picking up English-sounding names at a much higher rate. And so we know by this study and other studies that have been done that they really do have real-world impacts and effects. And so it is our responsibility to interrogate our unconscious biases, to think through, knowing that biases stem from an early age and develop as time progressed, to really interrogate and sit with our histories, both kind of our childhood, but also beyond that, thinking about kind of intergenerational experiences, but really think through our family history, growing up, and what are some of those ideologies, thoughts, beliefs that we hold on to, and thinking through some of the things we do and why we do them. Why do we do them the way that we do? How can we think through that differently? But really sitting through and thinking through this, the decisions and the impacts that are kind of happening right now and what they're rooted in. And so this video, Lisa shared this video with me, is a cycling awareness ad, but it does a really great job of illustrating the concept of unconscious and implicit bias. So I'm going to play the video and then talk about it.
This is an awareness test. How many passes does the team white? The answer is 13. But did you see the moonwalking bear?
How many folks saw the moonwalking bear the first time around? Like, I've seen this video a couple times and I still miss the bear. The unconscious and implicit biases play out in that very way. That if we're not looking for it, we may not even be aware that it exists. It's there, and we have to question it, we have to sit with it, reckon with it, interrogate it, and look at how we can move forward. Any questions so far?
I had a quick question. My name is Diane. I'm with the CLT as an ed developer in indigenization. Can you hear me okay? Okay. Yeah, I really just want to thank you for, creating the safe space where, I can even feel like I can ask a difficult question. And it's really not that difficult, but more of finding the right language to describe the wide gaps and the patterns and the persistence of inequities despite the policies and the principles that were laid out earlier. I'm curious, what that space is between what we know and say and we have written in policies, but yet have such wide glaring inequities that persist. Is there like a word or language for that?
I'm happy to speak to that, Diane. Lisa here. I don't know that there's a word per se, but I think that my own experience and my own approach is to acknowledge it, and to be really transparent about the fact that we have these frameworks in place, but we recognize that we have a lot of work to do. There's a lot of growth to happen when things go, in a way that we don't like to see them, then I often will say, this is not the way we like to see things done, like just to be really transparent about that. And, I think maybe you didn't say it directly, but maybe part of what I see with the question like this is how to have the conversation in a way that reduces a defensive response. Because I think we're in the business of calling out behavior that is inconsistent with our policies and our expectations, right? And so I think that institutions like a big university often are maybe believed to be sweeping things under the rug or, ignoring problems. And so I think in my own approach, and I think that people seem to appreciate that, is to be really open about the fact that, look, there is work to be done, to not pretend that things are as they should be, but rather to recognize that these frameworks are a reflection of the floor, again, not the ceiling of where we want to be, but we're not even at the floor sometimes. And so sometimes what's very hard is even figuring out where is the starting point of the conversation. You might walk into a meeting and you think that everyone is on the same page around wanting to, for example, support a student's accommodation, but trying to figure out how. And then someone speaks up and then you realize they actually don't believe that there ought to be accommodations at all, And so just that constant kind of recalibrating of where to start the conversation can be, it can be tasking, but that is what we do in our office as a on an everyday basis. And so certainly we're here to help those conversations and help navigate a customized way of trying to address it each time. Is that helpful?
Yeah, thank you. And I'm not sure if this is going to be covered in this session, but maybe being directed or referred to any documentation on the mechanisms or the ways that, say, issues are brought forward and addressed, like the steps that are taken.
Sure. I guess what's a little tricky about that is that it's quite customized. We have, under all of our policies, we have formal and we have informal options, and so we can kind of talk through those approaches. But most of our work does land in the informal sphere, and most of the times in the informal sphere, we'd figure it out based on what the context is. And so we do try to, where we can, engage in restorative approaches so that we can have conversations and bring all the relevant kind of, or bring as many people together as we can in a way that's, feasible and reasonable to try to figure out that solution. But absolutely, we have frameworks that we can share that might be helpful for guiding those conversations for sure.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for bringing forward that question, Diane. And if anyone else has questions, please feel free to raise your hand or pop it in the chat box, and we'll pause for questions throughout. So next we wanted to talk about navigating online environments. And by no means are we experts. I think we're all kind of navigating these environments together, and really kind of understanding what it means to be in this virtual reality. But as you know, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, educational institutions have shifted to remote learning, and many among our campus community are increasing their use of technology and various social media platforms. And this shift has highlighted a lot of the socioeconomic inequities and gaps. And I think that's one of the things that have been kind of seen and identified our office, that as we're kind of moving towards this technology-heavy world, what does that mean for various students, staff, faculty, given their positionality? And so really kind of highlighting the socioeconomic gaps, and that's kind of where we see further inequities, right? So kind of this pandemic has highlighted and has furthered these gaps and inequities, so it's even more crucial to have these spaces where folks feel like they can have these honest conversations with you, that they can identify barriers, that they can bring their concerns forward. We know that many people are feeling isolated and physically distanced from family and friends, and so that really creates, unfortunately, an environment where victimization can occur. And so we'll talk a little bit later about how sexual violence is really manifesting in online environments, and how this feeling of isolation is being, the word I'm looking for,
Pervasive, maybe?
exploited, I think is the word, yes.
Right.
And so while cyberbullying, harassment, and stalking aren't new issues for us as educators and PAs, the pervasiveness and impact of these incidents during distance learning may be unique. And so harassment on virtual platforms we know can be difficult. We know that it has the potential of reaching an overwhelming number of people in a matter of minutes. And that being connected to technology so constantly and consistently can leave the impact that there aren't many safe spaces. So bullies and harassers can sneak into the lives of students and make them feel like those safer spaces don't really exist. Students are more vulnerable to virtual sexual harassment, cyber stalking, and sharing of non-consensual pornography because it becomes easier for students to engage in this misconduct while hiding behind a computer screen. And we're seeing this kind of across various forms of discrimination and harassment. Really folks feeling more bold because of this anonymity and because of this kind of protection of a computer screen. We may see an increase in xenophobic and racist cyberbullying as racist stereotypes and anti-Asian sentiment in particular are perpetuated as it relates to the pandemic. It's really important for educators and bystander students to take the time to address ignorant misconceptions, misstatements, and other harmful behaviors online. And as Lisa mentioned, with sexualized violence in particular, and cyberbullying as well, we know that many victims do not disclose incidents to family or educators. They often go to folks who they feel a sense of trust with. And so when these incidents occur, folks may be impacted but feel silenced. And so it's really important that we're creating intentionally these spaces, that we're being vigilant and really recognizing that shared responsibility of creating these spaces, and again, centering and recognizing marginalization and positionality. So some tips for navigating the online environment. So setting expectations, being really clear and upfront about our expectations of respectful behavior among our students, and having these expectations posted in a highly visible area and revisiting these expectations as needed. As Lisa mentioned, really acknowledging kind of the moment that we're in and the reality is really important. So the pandemic being scary is one of them. So recognizing that everyone is adjusting to a new chaotic normal, and really pushing and kind of bringing to the forefront and centering how important it is to be kind to one another and to hold space for each other, and really come to this with a compassionate lens. Secure technology, so ensuring that all remote virtual sessions are secure and private from outsiders. So some suggestions there are to include passwords and other things like that. So I know a lot of folks are using Collaborate and things that are tied to Brightspace. So I know that privacy isn't a huge issue in that sense, but for folks who are doing educational programming on things like Zoom, just keeping these things in mind, because there have been, unfortunately, incidents where these technologies and spaces and conversations have been interrupted. Monitor interactions, keep close tabs on online interactions that are under your purview. Ensure that the content and the delivery, the way that it's presented, follows values and expectations. Create a safer space, so incorporate regular positive peer interactions. Check in with students who you know to be especially vulnerable and need a deeper connection, and those who need encouragement or accountability. So again, just being really intentional about the spaces you create, encouraging interaction in a positive way. And if there are folks that, need accountability, doing so in a way that is supported, that provides them with resources, and taps into the resources that are available on campus. And we'll talk a little bit about that. Megan, I see your hand, but I'm going to last and get to you. So informed reporting, ensure students know who, where, and how to report cyberbullying, harassment, and discrimination. So our office, and we'll talk about that, can be a resource in that, but there are other avenues and supports available as well. So I encourage you to look through kind of what's available within the departments and programs, but also what Dal has to offer. Any questions? And we'll go to Megan first, but feel free to raise your hand.
Sorry, hi, I thought I had to wait for you to unmute me. I apologize, I raised my hand a little bit early, but I was reading monitoring interactions. I was looking for suggestions when TA notices that one student is causing distress to another student in an online environment. Are you able to hear me?
Yes. That's right. That's an excellent point. And that's right. If you see something, the question is, what do you do, right? And so on the next slide, we'll talk about some of those resources that are available. And you've got a few different kind of ways. If you see something that is really quite concerning, certainly you should always feel welcome to either speak directly with the student or email them, connect directly with the student who's causing the harm and the one who's impacted, or connect with the faculty member who's overseeing the course and connect with them, or you can connect with our office as well and get some advice around, how to navigate the situation so that you can, make a good referral to the appropriate resources. But I think it's an excellent point though to keep an eye on it, because it can be very, very harmful.
And I think it's particularly hard when the TA is in the same social groups as.
That's right. And so, again, what people often find helpful is to have somebody else have that conversation, for them. And so to be able to get some confidential advice from an office like ours is often something that people do appreciate, having access to that resource,
Okay, thank you.
Great. So I can maybe move on to the next slide if that works for you, Amina, around the resources. So we have actually two separate pages. So I'm going to send you all the link as well. This is an outline of where to go for help. So resources, and we have one link for the Halifax area and a separate one for the Truro area, and I'll put those both in the chat. And so you can see, range of resources that would be available and appropriate depending on the context. And so we have our, the right side, I guess, of the page looks at Dalhousie resources, and so there's a list of a number of resources that are available, on our campuses, but also community-based resources. And so, like I said, I'll send you the links to the Truro one as well as the Halifax one, so that you can bookmark those in your own world. So I've sent the Halifax one, and I've sent the Truro one. And again, just to be aware that these resources do exist, because often it can be very stressful and people feel like they're carrying everything. And actually, very often when situations like these ones arise, it really is about making a good referral, right? You don't need to carry the entire situation, and actually to do so can be inadvertently cause you and the other person some stress, right? Good. So that's a list of some resources, and I've sent you some links. We also have some reports and some policies that are really helpful frameworks for your own reference and for your reading review to help build your understanding of the basis for and the types of resources that are available. So the ones that we've identified here include the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, the Equity, Diversity, Inclusion at Canadian Universities report, the Dalhousie Belong report, Dalhousie's report on Lord Dalhousie's history on slavery and race. We also have campus policies. And so again, we wouldn't want you to feel like you have to read and interpret them, but there are folks in the university who can help you navigate them. And very often people find it helpful just to start with our office. And if it's not ours, we can refer you to the appropriate place. So some campus policies that have been identified here include our discrimination policy, our sexualized violence policy. The university also has a gender affirmation policy, which is specific to creating space and confirming and affirming the right to your gender identity, and so that to be respected. We have a personal harassment policy that we talked about, a code of student conduct. There's a university hazing policy and employment equity policy, and that is aimed at building and supporting an inclusive working environment that is reflective of society, as opposed to one that does not reflect our population. So our office, Human Rights and Equity Services, we provide trauma-informed, survivor-centered, confidential advisory service to members of the Dalhousie community seeking advice and support related to the themes that we've talked about. So human rights, discrimination, harassment, sexualized violence, equity and inclusion, accommodation and accessibility. We also do a lot of work around conflict. So something might not be at the level where a formal policy might apply, or people might not want to engage in formal policy, but do want to have some support around navigating conflict, whether that includes formal mediation or even just quiet advice in terms of how an individual might raise a concern with somebody that they're struggling, in a relationship they're struggling with. Our services include confidential reporting, informal and formal complaint options, personal support and referrals. We also do coaching, we facilitate conflict resolution processes. We do a lot, Amina does a lot of education and outreach and facilitation of workshops. So we've now got a couple of scenarios that we thought would be helpful to talk through. And again, in this online format, it might be best to do a combination of maybe using the chat group, or you can speak up if your microphones are working now. So I'll just read the scenario, and then we'll invite folks to share some thoughts in terms of what to do. So scenario 1, Keisha, one of your students, informs you that Steve, another one of your students, has been constantly messaging her on various platforms. At first, Keisha responded to the messages, but then no longer felt comfortable in engaging in the conversation. Steve is relentless in his messaging, despite being blocked on several platforms. So the question is, how would you respond, and what supports and resources may you wish to seek out or wish to share? So it's a tricky one, I know. Hey, I know that it's tricky. So what we have is a situation where maybe there was some level of consent to engage at one point, but she reached a point where she's no longer agreeing. It says he's relentless in his messaging despite being blocked on several platforms. So let's assume that it's a forum that is required as part of the course, for example. So we regularly become involved in situations like this, our office. The first thing that should happen, and it doesn't need to be, need to arrange a discussion with Steve. That's right. It doesn't need to be Keisha who has that conversation. And I see Christine's comment. It is very, very common. But the first thing that should happen is Steve should have that message clearly communicated to him. We often will have that conversation at our end on our office, and we also very regularly work with Dal Security Services. And we, typically it starts as a very informal process. It starts as a, this is for your information that this behavior is unwelcome and does need to stop. If the behavior doesn't stop, then it very quickly can evolve into a harassment kind of situation. And when somebody's been told to stop engaging in this way, it can become actually criminal harassment. So what I didn't mention earlier is we have a personal harassment policy at Dal, but there are also, legal protections against harassment. It's sort of through that criminal framework, and particularly in a situation like this, if somebody is persistent and they're not getting the hint, and they've been told directly that they need to stop, then this can become, a matter that becomes much more serious quite quickly. So we do regularly engage in creating space for having those conversations. The second thing that I think we want to turn our minds to is how to support Keisha through this as well. And so, as you've seen, there's a list of resources on the previous page. Sometimes a student, in a situation like Keisha's, just might want to sit down with our advisor and just talk it through, process what happened, kind of reflect on it, and maybe consider, additional supports that might be helpful going forward. Anything that we haven't talked about that you wanted to add to this scenario? Yeah, that's right. So we do often engage in some accommodations in response to situations like this. And it might be a situation where we do need to shuffle the groups around, right? You typically don't want to move the person who has been victimized unless that is their wish. You typically want to do, if you have to make that level of accommodation, you really you want to reduce and mitigate the impact that that's going to have on the individual. And so I would talk to Keisha and see what it is that Keisha would like to see happen before making any decision. But certainly what we want to do is set some pretty clear boundaries for Steve, and then create and do what we can to make a safe space for Keisha going forward. Is that helpful? And again, I can't overstate that there are supports for difficult situations. It can be very, very stressful for a TA, for a faculty member to try to navigate it. And so we are certainly here. I would report it. I would connect. Again, follow Keisha's lead. It depends on the content. It depends on the level of engagement, but certainly talk to Keisha and see what Keisha would like to see happen. If it was a situation that was maybe a bit of a romantic relationship that went sideways and Steve doesn't maybe take the hint, then Keisha might feel like uncomfortable disclosing that. But on the other hand, there are situations where the student does want the professor to know, just so that they can be mindful to not put them, for example, in the same group. And we have had situations where, depending on the level of behavior, where Steve might have to go to a different class, actually, and there may be policy frameworks that come into play that do result in some other disciplinary measures that impact a student. But again, that's further down the road. So at the first instance where we are here, I think talk to Keisha and follow their lead in terms of what they'd like to see happen. Good. So we don't have much more time, and I want to leave a bit of time for discussion. So let's look at scenario 2 really quickly. Scenario 2. 2 years ago, Zelda, a student UTA, came out to your department as non-binary and has informed your department of their usage of they-them pronouns. Zelda informs you today that Chad, another classmate, has consistently misgendered them all semester. How would you respond? What supports and resources may you wish to seek out or share? So we didn't really get into gender identity as a what we talked about as a protected characteristic, but misgendering someone, so refusing to acknowledge somebody's pronouns, can quickly become discrimination and harassing behaviors, right? And so again, in my experience, anyone who is maybe going through a name change, a gender identity shift, they recognize that it might take a bit of time before everyone's kind of up to speed, but this is a situation where I think it's quite clear that it is persistent and it's pervasive, and that is the kind of language that is associated with discrimination or harassment complaints, right? And so this is a situation where Chad, I think we can assume, is refusing to engage in a way that's inappropriate. We have a situation where we have some discriminatory behavior that is happening. So the question is, how would you respond, and what resources might you want to connect with? So my suggestion would be, was somebody putting up a hand? Okay. My suggestion would be to certainly, depending on how it comes to your attention. For example, let's assume that, it was Zelda that informed you. So I would say to Zelda, you want to be really clear in saying that is not okay. You want to support Zelda in being safe and being able to be respected in a way that is consistent with our values and our expectations. And I would ask Zelda how Zelda would like to see that conversation with Chad happen. Sometimes students would say, I want to have the conversation myself, but I just want it to be in a safe and supportive way. Other times students will say, I want it to stop happening. And so, kind of following that lead, certainly you have now this knowledge and this responsibility to follow up. And so you can connect with our office in terms of getting advice. You can connect with the faculty member, and we will support that conversation happening with Chad. I could have it, or you could have it, or the professor could have it, for example, to be very, very clear that the behavior is inappropriate and it does need to stop, but also to connect with Zelda around what Zelda needs. And again, this might be a situation where, we may need to explore group options. We may need to explore sort of whether students are working together, and maybe do some accommodations in that regard as well. And also to ensure that Zelda is aware of the supports and resources that are available to them. Okay. That can include our office. It can include counseling services. You can look on the list. There are some community resources that might be helpful in this situation as well. Good. And then we've just got one more quick scenario that we'll walk through with you to have this one on your radar. Scenario 3, Cam, the other TA for your course, made a racially charged comment on a discussion board that several students brought to your attention. How would you respond? Again, what supports and resources might you wish to seek out or share? That's a tricky one where it's your colleague, but again, inappropriate, right? So we have a situation where, go ahead. Yes, that's what I was going to say. Christine says she'd probably go to the prof. This is a situation, where it is somebody who is at the same level as you, and so you're not in a position of, authority, for example. So that would be my first suggestion too. If I were a TA and another TA said it, I would probably go to the prof. Take a screen capture of it or a photo of it if it's helpful, and yeah, you can speak to them first. You can also do that. Bring it to their attention if that's something that you're comfortable doing. Yeah. Again, as you can kind of see from these scenarios, there are so many variables and there's so much context that matters. And that's why we typically are very customized in terms of how we respond. That's right. It depends on how close you are to the other TA. If it's somebody, for example, that you know well, and this is very out of character, then it might be a situation where you want to bring it to their attention that they may have used a racist term without knowing it. And that does happen actually quite frequently, where a comment might be made and somebody might not appreciate the history or the context and not understand that it is inappropriate. Or if it is, if it's somebody that, there might be some concerns about how they're doing. If this behavior is out of character, then it might be that there are some concerns about the other TA, drinking at work, or, maybe, being in a situation where they're not doing so well. So for example, in this case, there are a lot of different ways that could go, but we just want to invite you to think through how you would want to personally deal with it, but also what other resources that might be available. So, and the example that was shared a while ago in relation to cultural appropriation was an example where a third party was brought in to have a debrief with the entire class, and it sounds like that was a positive and successful outcome. So it might be that there needs to be some follow-up with the group. I would suggest there ought to be some follow-up with the group if it was a discussion board for the students, and the students saw it and the students were upset about it. So certainly that's an option as well. Wonderful. Well, that brings us to the end of our scenarios, and we only have a few moments left in terms of to questions or discussion. So we wanted to make sure we've got a bit of time to have that conversation. So Patricia says, I think I would advise him to take it down as well because it continues to cause damage. That's exactly right. As long as it's up there, anything that's available is going to cause harm, and the more people that see it, the more that harm will be spread, right? Excellent. Well, thank you, everybody. I see that we've got about 3 minutes. If there are any questions that that you wanted to raise, or any conversation points that you wanted to float for us, and certainly our contact information is available on your screen, and you can always find us online as well. Wonderful. Amina, is there anything further that you would like to add?
No, I just wanted to really thank everyone for their participation and questions and really engaging with the material. It was a really great session, and just really appreciate everyone's contributions.
Wonderful. Excellent. Well, thank you, everybody.
Really appreciate it.
Okay, but we're almost at Wonderful. Well, good luck, everybody. It's such an important role to be doing the work that you're doing, and I really appreciate your taking the time to listen.
Thank you both so much. I will turn off the recording now.